Hello everyone. This is a rather spontaneous video. I just wanted to share my experience using drive encryption, partition encryption. So for the longest time I've been using Truecrypt to encrypt Windows, so much so that I never looked at BitLocker. Partly because Truecrypt works on multiple platforms. It works on Windows, it works on Linux, and in fact some distribution of Linux come with it, like the repair utility disk called Parted Magic. It has Truecrypt installed, and native application called Crypt Setup on Linux actually after a certain version is capable of working with the Truecrypt volumes, so you don't even need to install Truecrypt. So that makes it possible for me to do full image backups of Windows partition. And I guess I didn't realize that Windows 7 introduced system image creation backup capability. So Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10 has it. I don't know if Windows Vista had it, but definitely not Windows XP. In those days you had to use third-party software to do that, and that was a pain because you had to purchase, and you didn't know which one is a good one, and I kind of didn't trust it back then to be able to do a system image backup from within the operating system that is running. But because Microsoft wrote this backup, I kinda trusted a little more. But even then, I didn't want to save the backup onto the same drive onto the system drive where Windows is installed. So I partitioned the disk in such a way that I used one partition for the system backups. There is also a file history backup capability that's available in Windows 10. I don't know if Windows 7 had it, and that one is pretty straightforward. Windows takes periodically every 30 minutes or an hour, or whatever time you define in that setting. In fact, let's hold on. Let's open Control Panel. So to open Control Panel, you can scroll all the way down to Windows System, and Control Panel is right there. But I also have pinned it to the Start menu. So let's quickly go to the Control Panel. Come on, computer, you can do it. This is rather a spontaneous video, so it's probably gonna be a bit longish, but here's the file history, and I have it configured. So let's see, advanced settings, daily. So I have it set to daily, but you can do it every 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and so forth. But this seems to be excessive. Especially if you are working on some documents or some files, and every 10 minutes it will be saving a copy of the file, so the space will fill up quickly. And then you define how long to keep it, until space is needed, 3 months, or forever, which is default. So that's a little strange. The BitLocker, and then in file history you pick where to store. So you see I'm using a drive D. In fact, let's go to the disk management. So I right clicked on the Start menu, and there's the disk management. Or you can go through the main menu, scroll all the way down, go into Windows Administrative Tools, and let's see, print management performance. So yeah, so it's going to be inside computer management. This is kind of still part of classic control panels. See Windows 10 and Windows 8, I suppose, too. They kind of introduced additional settings and they've built the interfaces for those, but the classic control panel still remain behind the scenes, and they also build new interfaces for some of the functionality of the classic control panel. So you could tweak certain settings through the new interfaces, but obviously I'm more familiar with the classic control panel. So here we see how the disk is partitioned. This is CD-ROM, so disregard it. It's got a Debian installation CD in it. So as far as the disk partitioning goes, I ended up with 5 different partitions. Partition number 1 is the Linux boot partition. That's where grub lives, that's where Linux kernel lives, and the init.rd file lives. And that's because this partition right here, this 20 gig partition, is a Linux root partition that's encrypted with the LUKS encryption, LUKS, LUKS, Linux Unified Key Security, I think it stands for. And I've also created a swap partition, which I'm not sure that this computer really needs it. It's got 7 gigs of memory, and that's more than enough for Linux, and but Windows might exceed it. But this is for my kids, and they will be not using anything super heavy on this computer. And there's a utility that existed for a long time. Okay, what was it trying to do? Okay, I just want to open File Explorer. That allows you to actually represent the swap partition, make it available in Windows. So you see it gets mounted, and that's where I put the page file onto. So 1 gigabyte worth of page file. So that way I reclaim some space on the C drive, but I still end up with hyperfill.sys and a new swap file.sys that Windows introduced. I'm not sure, I haven't really looked up what the Windows swap file sys is used for, but the swap partition is doing double duty. It works in Linux and it works in Windows, so it's not completely wasted. But so yeah, so I'm not doubling up, you know, having Windows store page file.sys on C drive and then having Linux use a file-based swap partition, because that's also a possibility that within this partition I could just create a file, you know, format it with the swap utility, and then define it as the swap container, and Linux would work with it that way. So I needed 5 partitions, so that means that I had to create an extended partition. I prefer not to do that, and in the past I didn't need this extra NTFS partition for Windows backups. I would just have one single partition for Windows where it would do everything. So I would have the Linux boot partition, Windows partition, Linux root partition that's encrypted, and a swap. Swap is unencrypted, and that's a security risk, but you know, who's really going to be digging inside my computer if it falls into the wrong hands? I'm not such an important persona, which is a bad excuse. A lot of people say the same thing about Google collecting data or Facebook collecting data, and people say, well, I don't, you know, I'm not an important, you know, that important of a person. I don't have anything that important on, you know, information. I don't make posts and so forth. But that's a bad excuse, because that weakens the idea of privacy and opens up these companies for taking advantage. Data is the new currency. But in any case, so the Windows partition is encrypted with VeraCrypt, which is a successor to Truecrypt. If you are familiar with the history, Truecrypt existed for a while, and then suddenly they shut down, saying that there is some kind of security vulnerability that exists in Truecrypt, and that they recommended people to use BitLocker for Windows, because it's matured and it's easy to use. Now let's go and find the paint command, and I will give you a little bit more explanation of what. Let's see, paint. We don't need paint 3D. I don't even know what that is, but it's still selected paint 3D. So let's see if it looks anything like familiar paint application. We will resize it. Get more white space this way. So what do I have in terms of shapes? Do I have a rectangle? Okay. So imagine that this is a hard disk, and if you ever installed Windows on a clean PC, you wipe the drive and you installed Windows 7. I think Vista started doing it. Windows Vista, Windows 7. So basically after Windows XP, Microsoft started to format, and if you purchased a PC from a vendor and Windows came pre-installed, what you would find is that at the beginning of the drive, no, let's see, image, select, no, we don't want to select it, shapes, outline, fill. I can't seem to draw inside this rectangle. It's alright, so I'll just indicate on the outside of it. So let's say, beginning of the disk, there is a small partition where Windows stores its bootloader, and then the rest of the Windows occupies the rest of the disk. And I didn't understand why Windows doing that, and they would mark this little partition as a system partition, and then the rest would be just the normal partition, but both are configured as NTFS. But that's because if you are to encrypt your system, your Windows partition with BitLocker, you need a boot manager that will know how to request for a password or a key file, which Microsoft allows to use key files for system partitions. Truecrypt does not. Truecrypt only allows passwords, which is in a way a security feature, because if you have a key file, you gotta store it somewhere on a USB key or somewhere, and you have to protect it, because if somebody gets a hold of that key file, they'll be able to decrypt your partition. So Windows has a small partition, where boot partition resides. This is the same story with Linux, that you need an unencrypted boot partition where grub lives and the kernel lives and the init.rd file lives, so that when the machine boots up, it is able to decrypt the main container. And inside the main container, a lot of time people configure this partition with logical volume manager to allow for easier resizing of partitions later on, and so they might have a root partition, a home partition and let's say a swap partition, but all of it is encrypted. Let's see. Yeah. I don't know how to use paint, obviously. So that's how people did it a lot of the times. How do you select things in no, select all, we don't want that. Image, select, rectangular selection. So if I select this, hit delete. So that's how Linux works. So similar, Windows and Linux work in a similar fashion. Now Truecrypt is an exception to this rule. So what happens with Truecrypt is that, here's your hard drive, and at the very beginning of the hard drive, let's see, am I still drawing rectangles? I'll draw a blue rectangle. So at the very beginning of the, oh no, I'm in the select mode. At the very beginning of the hard drive is something called master boot record, MBR. I don't know what the GPT-based computers do it. I'm still kind of behind the times. I mostly have old computers that I use, and I'm using the MBR. But in any case, the partition table lives at this very beginning of the hard drive, and then there is some space in between the MBR and where the rest of the hard drive is available for creating partitions. And so Truecrypt bootloader, part of it lives in a tiny spot within the MBR. The MBR has the partition table, and it has a little bootstrap type type code. But in order to deal with encryption, you need a little more space, and so Truecrypt put code in the space in between. And by the way, Linux Grub does that too. It puts code in there, and it's called stage 1.5, but it still requires a boot partition to boot up the kernel, which will then request to decrypt the rest of the drive. Now so that's Truecrypt. So if you wanted to do dual boot, Windows and Linux, on a machine, and you use Truecrypt, then in the past you would create a partition for Windows, and usually Windows is more space hungry. You would create a partition for Windows, and then you would create a partition for Linux. Oh, it made everything green. And let's say you left a little space to do a swap. No, it's still green. To do a swap partition, which, as I demonstrated, you can use in. Oh no, I'm sorry. I am leading you astray. Select rectangular section. So with the Truecrypt scenario, oh, that didn't delete it. That assigned it a new color. Oh, I'm now lost in space. Well, okay, let's see if I can resize this existing one. No, I can't do that either. Oh man, paint is limited. Size, shapes, edit colors, tools. Okay. Alright, well then what we'll do is we will disregard this. So strike a line through this. We disregard this. So what you would do with a dual boot Windows Linux installation is that you would create, no, that's not what I want. You would create outline, yeah. You would create a small, I need a rectangle. You would create a small boot partition. Then you would place Windows, because for the longest time Windows liked to be as close to the beginning of the disk as possible. It wasn't capable of booting from further down in the disk. And then you would have the root partition for Linux, and you would have a swap partition that could be encrypted and just used with Linux, or it could be decrypted and using that custom driver that somebody wrote be used in Windows as well as in Linux. So you end up with 1, 2, 3, 4 partitions, and that's the maximum that MBR master boot record can hold, unless you create what's called an extended partition. And when you create an extended partition, you can put 4 partitions inside of it. And I believe you can create an extended partition inside an extended partition, and so that way you kind of get yourself more potential partitions, and you have more flexibility. However, you got to remember that extended partitions, they're formatted kind of like a physical drive, so they have an MBR of their own and the space in between too, so you're kind of losing a little bit on disk space, which is most likely negligible. It doesn't really matter so much. So but my present situation is such that I wanted to create, so I wanted to do backups, for Windows to do backups, so that because this computer is going to be with my kids, they're not with me, I wouldn't be able to do full image backups of the computer periodically from within Linux. So I looked into this Windows automatic backup feature for both the file history and for the system images. But I don't, so I need a data partition. So what I did is I created so let's say this is the MBR. So this is the MBR. Now let's see if I can pick color number 2, and yeah, okay. And so then I've got Windows OS partition, and then nope, that changes color. And then I create this data partition where the backups are to go, and then create a Linux root partition, and there you have it: boot, Windows, data, Linux. That's 4 partitions. But in this case, as I demonstrated, I created an extended partition so that I ended up with 5 of them. But in terms of encryption, I would normally so just out of habit, because that's what I've done all along, is that I would encrypt Windows and this data partition because they have NTFS in there. And this has NTFS too, which is the type of file system that Windows uses. And the boot partition is also ext4. So that's what I would do with, and so this right here is encrypted with Truecrypt. And then Linux is encrypted with LUKS. Encrypted with LUKS. And so that way I end up with just one little boot partition for Linux that uses grub to boot up Linux. It cannot boot up these Windows partitions. So what ends up happening is the MBR, so I'm not doing text anymore. Let's see. I need to, whoops, that got rid of everything there. But so if we look at the MBR, and like I said, Truecrypt lives in there and lives in the space in between. But when you install Windows, and let's say, you know, this is right here, you know, Windows 7, 8, or 10, and I think Vista was also, and here is data, and here is Linux root, and this is Linux boot, and this right here is MBR. So when you install Windows, it overrides that little space of code in the MBR that knows how to boot Windows. Well, actually, hold on. When you encrypt Windows and, you know, let's say data, in this case with Truecrypt, Truecrypt places its own little bootloader into MBR and into the space in between. So this is what the usable portion of the hard drive looks like. So Truecrypt places code inside the MBR and into the space in between, and it knows how to unlock the Windows partitions. And the data partition you configure in Truecrypt as a quote-unquote favorite volume that gets unlocked together with the Windows system partition. But inside Windows, you are able to configure a menu option to boot this Linux boot partition. And so when you do that, then you are able to decrypt the root partition and Linux and boot it up that way. There's also an option in Truecrypt where you just press the escape key and it automatically finds the boot partition and boots up into Linux. Once you press the escape, you can't get into Windows anymore. And Truecrypt would be only password based. Like I said, Truecrypt does not allow to use key files, basically files that contain just random data, which is a stronger level of security than a passphrase, than a password, because people oftentimes pick pretty weak passwords, and hackers have these dictionaries of passwords, of common passwords, so they can potentially discover your password. And of course there are stories of people writing passwords on sticky notes and putting them underneath the keyboard. And so if somebody physically gets a hold of the computer, they see the sticky note and passwords right there. So key files. So but you can use key files with LUKS encryption in Linux. I believe. Don't quote me on that. I don't know exactly for fact that that's the case. But here's the situation. We basically have two types of encryption: Truecrypt and LUKS. But what I discovered when trying to do the system encryption, I discovered that Windows does not like Truecrypt encrypted partitions. Let's see, I'm trying to remember how it was exactly. Yeah, basically it wouldn't let me back up onto a Truecrypt encrypted partition, so I needed to do something different. So instead of encrypting, how do you select things in here and get rid of them? Line. No, I can't select it. Image select. Rectangular selection. And then how do I delete it? No, that just fills it. No, that doesn't do it either. Well, what if we just paint white over it? That should work. So we oh no, I need to do something like this and fill it with solid color that is white. Okay, so I figured out how to get rid of. So I had to encrypt this partition because because that's sensitive data. Your full system backups as well as the file history contain sensitive data. What's the point of encrypting Windows OS partition and Linux OS partition as well as home, where your documents live and everything, while the data partition remains decrypted, in plain form? So the only option that I had for that was BitLocker. So that's where BitLocker comes in. The next complication that I encountered is that if the OS partition in Windows is encrypted with something else besides BitLocker, or it's not encrypted at all and you just encrypted the data partition, which also doesn't make sense. Why would you encrypt the data partition and not encrypt the OS partition? So in that scenario, if the OS partition of Windows is not encrypted with BitLocker, which also requires a separate little partition for Windows to boot, so it wouldn't allow to automatically mount the BitLocker encrypted data partition. But there is a way, and I will demonstrate how that's done. So back to the computer image here. So here's the Windows partition. It's encrypted with, well, in this case, VeraCrypt, which is a successor to Truecrypt. This is the Linux boot partition. This is the data partition encrypted with BitLocker. You see it pops up here. It says BitLocker. If we enlarge this window, then we get more. Yeah, BitLocker encrypted right there. And this is Linux. You see Windows doesn't recognize it at all. Well, Windows doesn't recognize ext4 either, or the swap one. It doesn't recognize it. It doesn't know anything about Linux. So you have to do third-party stuff to access Linux drives. But this is the root and home partition for Linux, and this is the swap partition, which is unencrypted, which is a security risk, but it would take somebody special skills. It's not as simple to look inside the swap partition and figure out what is there, because swap partition is writing stuff that goes into RAM normally, and you know, it's just variables and programs executing, and so there are bits of data, but it's not represented in the form of files, and you can't mount it as a file system and have directories and files and so forth. So I consider that to be okay. Okay, so enough painting. Let's actually look at what we have. So there we have the Windows operating system partition with documents and settings. So if we go on to users, let's say my kid's account, you've got downloads, you've got documents, you've got pictures, you've got videos, and you've got music. You know, everything is here. And so the data partition is encrypted with BitLocker, and there's the file history, and it just plainly copies the file. So if we go into the kids folder, data, but they don't have any files there. C drive, users, kids. I don't know why Windows, why Microsoft, you know, did all this. So you see you've got documents, downloads, Dropbox, OneDrive, pictures. Is there anything in documents? Yeah, there is a directory for the user guide for the computer that got backed up. So here's a PDF file that got backed up, and it's got a timestamp of when it got backed up on 12th of February. Oh, UTC time, right. So it wrote the timestamp in UTC. So then if we go back out, we go to data, you see we have Windows image backup, and we have, you know, the name of the computer here backup. You know, this is where these system backups go. Oh, it actually, you know, it's a special type of folder, maybe not even a folder at all. manage space used, restore from backup, so we can't really even look inside of it. No, nope, 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 we can't. But Windows image backup, computer name, what was that permission question that I just agreed to? I'm not sure. I can't cancel out of it. Okay, it finished trying to access it. You see backup on the 11th. So if we look inside of it, click continue to permanently get access to this folder. Oh, that's fine. That's for my account. I'm logged in with my own admin account. So it finished trying to access that directory, and you see there's an XML file which probably has information about the backup, and there's a number of files. Yeah, and then we don't have the privilege to open this file, but backup specs kind of gives it away. And so registry excludes writer additional files, but one of the files is called Vhdx, which VHD in Windows speak is virtual hard drive. So this is an image, this is a system image of the C drive, of the C partition, and you see it's 56 gigs in size. So that's about as much as there is on the C drive. So if we look at properties, 41.7 gigabytes used. So I must have deleted some stuff since the backup took place. But there's your image backup. And like I said, I kind of trust Microsoft that they know what they're doing. They have some processes that are called shadow copy service that is able to read the contents while they're being accessed by the user. These backups take place potentially while you're using the system. So enough of that. So there's the D drive. And if we go back out to control panel and we go system and security and we look at BitLocker drive encryption, we see that the operating system drive gives us an option of turn on BitLocker. Windows doesn't understand that C drive is encrypted with Truecrypt. It kind of believes that it's not encrypted at all. The D drive is mounted. It says BitLocker on, so it is encrypted. There's a padlock icon, but it doesn't give us an option of auto mount. I didn't insert a USB flash drive. Let me pause for a second and bring a flash drive. Okay, I am back, and I've brought an SD card and I inserted it, and you see it gives us an option to turn on BitLocker on the SD card. It says BitLocker is off. It's not encrypted. Now, an important option that Windows is giving us is backup your recovery key. You unlock the BitLocker drives with a password, and we have the option of change the password, or we can remove the password and just rely on the recovery key. But that would make our life a little harder, because recovery key is just a long string of numbers. So if you do that, you would have to type those in on the command line, or potentially if you are unlocking. See, it says turn on auto unlock, but if I click on that, yeah, the operating system drive is not protected by BitLocker drive encryption, so this option is not really available to us. If I turn off BitLocker, the data drive is gonna get locked again. Okay, so Windows is thinking about that for a minute. Okay. Oh. That's not what I wanted to do. Oh my lord. It's now decrypting the drive. And that's gonna take a while. I wanted to unmount it instead of decrypt it. And I don't have an option to stop it. Okay, well, I'm gonna have to pause then. Oh, here we go. What if I close? No, it's still doing it. Well, actually, it's doing pretty well. It's got 26% completed. So we'll have to re-encrypt it. So I'm gonna pause and let it do the decryption, and then I guess it will end up being a demonstration of how to turn on the BitLocker and encrypt the drive, but the key will change, which means that the method for automatically unlocking this drive, I will have to replace the key that I've used before, which is fine. It will be part of the process of demonstrating this. So I'm gonna pause and let it decrypt, and then we will re-encrypt it, and we'll end up with new keys. I will obviously reuse the password, but I will end up with new keys. So talk to you in a minute. So here's a quick update on what's going on with the decryption process. It is taking longer than I hoped. You see it, you know, when I stopped the recording, it was at like 25%, and now that it's been 15 or 20 minutes or so, it's at 38%. So it's taking time, and if we look at the disk activity, we can see that it's reading and writing to disk, and the it sort of bounces around the speed, the read speed and write speed, with maximum of about 17 megabytes per second. And it's a SATA drive inside, but it takes time. You see the CPU is not pegged. Obviously the CPU is used because the decryption process takes up CPU because it's converting data. So it might be slowing down. Memory is fine, 2.7 out of 6 gigs, so we're not short on memory, but we are reading and writing. And let's see if we can. No, we can't break down by individual disks. It's kind of combined disk activity, C drive and D drive, but C drive shouldn't be getting very much in terms of oh, this is the active time. That's really jagged. The actual transfer rate is here below, and you see there's a line for 60 megabytes per second and 100 megabytes per second, but we are in the ballpark of 10 megabytes per second on average. Probably we do get up to 17 at times, but we drop down to 2 megabytes per second. So it's reading and writing 38.5% completed. But I can't stop this process midways because that would leave the drive in an inconsistent state. If I try to kill this process, for example, then I would basically hose that drive and I would have to reformat it and start from scratch, and I would lose all of the data that's on it right now. And I have full image backups that I performed from Linux with utilities like FS Archiver and part image and plain old DD command. So I don't want to lose those. So I'm just gonna have to wait for it and pause the recording and then come back, and the next step that we'll do is we will turn on the BitLocker on that drive again, which will change our decryption key, because the way cryptography works is that there is randomness that's used, and so it would be a different key. And then when we install a key when we create a key file for locking and unlocking the drive, the key file would be different too. So basically the old encryption key and key file will be useless, but that will give us an opportunity to demonstrate how that works and what happens. But I'm gonna pause in the meantime and then come back when it's finished decrypting, and I will show you what the screen looks like to begin the BitLocker encryption, and I would have to pause again. So this is going to take some time, so I'm going to be pausing the recording so that you guys don't have to sit through hours of decryption and encryption. As you can see, Windows is reporting that decryption of the D drive is complete. So now let's have a look at what options it gives us, and it gives us the same option as for the system partition, Windows system partition, and it's turn on BitLocker, and that's what we'll do, and I expect that it will ask us to create a password. And I would say that that's a strong aspect of this computer. Doesn't have a smart card reader, so we can't take advantage of that, which in my mind is a really good idea, because smart cards, they store a private key. they use the PKI, the private public key cryptography. And nobody can get to the private key that's within the smart card chip. So now we're gonna have a new key. So I'm gonna go to the C drive. I created a directory here called BitLocker, and in here I have the previous key and key file saved, but they're no longer valid. So I'm gonna go ahead and delete them. I also, as you remember, inserted an SD card to emulate a USB drive. So gives us the option to save to Microsoft account, save to a USB flash drive, save to a file, or just simply print it, which that's the least secure option there is. So let's do save to a file and save to USB flash drive and demonstrate that it is an identical action. So we go to C drive, the BitLocker directory, and we save the key, and it's just a long numeric string. If we go to a USB flash drive, it detects that we have one, and we click save, and then if we actually look at the flash drive, well, hey, it actually saved the key file. That's interesting. What about the BitLocker directory? No, in the BitLocker directory saved to a file, we only got the text file. 2F4C2 2F4C200A0A. It's the same text file, but we've got the key. So that allows us to skip one command in what I was gonna demonstrate. But in any case, back to the BitLocker. So now we click next, and it's gonna start encrypting. Encrypt use disk space only, faster and best for new PCs and drives. Slower but best for PCs and drives already in use. Well, the idea is that once again the space that appears to be empty, potentially has been occupied by files previously, and somebody with forensic tools, with recovery tools, can potentially recover some files and recover some vulnerable data, some data that you don't want anybody to get their hands on. But this is a private PC, and we're not that paranoid. We don't expect. So Windows 10 version introduces a new disk encryption mode, XTS AES, modifies additional titles for version compatible with older versions of Windows. So this is not a removable drive, so we don't need the older version. It's a fixed drive. Will only be used on devices running at least Windows 10 or later. Should use the new encryption. So we're going to use the new encryption. You'll be able to unlock this drive using a password, and encryption might take a while. Well, we know that. Okay, so I'm gonna pause and let it run and go do some other things in the meantime. So the encryption of D drive is complete, and this was kind of a side maneuver that I didn't expect to do. It was a very confusing option in the GUI that Windows has that says turn off BitLocker. It should have said something like decrypt the drive rather than turn off BitLocker, because I took it to understand as dismount the drive, but they don't give you that option. You can only do that from the command line, so the GUI is lacking. You can do a much more on the command line, but what we discovered is that when you save the encryption key to a USB, either flash drive, or in my case I'm using an SD card, which SD card readers, even though they're internal, they're still USB, considered as USB. So Windows then saves the key file, encryption key file as well. And I kind of shudder to think that when you use the option to auto unlock a drive when the Windows system partition is also encrypted, that Windows basically gives you the option to use that flash drive, and it will automatically remember what's the name of the key file and would allow you to decrypt that way. So then that flash drive becomes very important to keep safe, because if you lose it, not only do you lose your encryption key, the log numeric string. In fact, let's close this and let's have a look at the encryption key, and I will show you what I mean by a long string of numbers. In fact, I think that long string of numbers is even in the name of the file. Yes, it is. Look at this. 2F4C2 2F4C200DA. That's the encryption key that you can use instead of the password. And if you are using the command line, then and then there's also a recovery. Oh, that's an identifier actually. Okay, hold on. So that's the identifier of the password value, because it gets stored in a hashed way. So this is what the hash that Windows uses produces. This is the recovery key that you can use on the command line, and I imagine that you can feed this recovery key file. It also becomes kind of like the recovery key file, so I imagine that you can feed it from the command line as well, and Windows will parse the file and use the recovery key. So once again, this is an important file that you can keep, that you need to keep safe, because now you're dependent on it. Password is something you carry in your head, and unless somebody is torturing you to give it up, you you know, it's kind of secure because it doesn't exist on physical media. But they give you even an option to print it out, and then you need to keep that printout secure so that nobody gets it. So it's a weak spot. It's a trade-off between convenience and security, and Windows has gone with the convenience route more than security route, because Truecrypt does not let you create or insert a key file, and it doesn't have these kind of recovery key values either. So when you encrypt a system partition with Truecrypt, it's only the password that will work. Well, actually, I'm lying. They do create a recovery CD, but I believe when you boot up that CD, it still asks you for the password. So it is gone the route of security more than the route of convenience. So now we need to we saw that this recovery key gets saved if you save it on a physical drive, on a fixed drive, but the key file does not. But we use the key file in the command to automatically schedule a decryption of the encrypted partition, which Windows does not give you that option in a and I'm gonna also copy the name of it. So I'm gonna do the rename and then Control C, or we can right click and copy the value. We know that it's a BEK extension. So let's go look at what the BitLocker GUI shows us. So now it shows that the D drive is mounted, and it gives you this turn off BitLocker function that I took to understand as dismount the drive. Turn on auto lock, as we demonstrated, doesn't work. Add a smart card is a good choice, because like I said, smart cards are pretty secure, but most computers do not have a smart card reader. You can purchase an external one that plugs into USB. Most of my laptops have a smart card reader, and as a citizen of Estonia, I do have a smart card, so I can play around with actually seeing how that feature works. You can remove the password, but once you do that, then you're going to be dependent on the recovery key and recovery key file, which you can only execute from a command line, and it doesn't give you the option of dismounting it. So Windows is kind of interesting this way. But now I'm curious to play around with BitLocker a little bit more and install Windows into a virtual machine and encrypt the system partition, the C drive, and see what option Windows gives you and how does the unlocking works. Once again, I suspect that it will offer you to save the recovery key and the recovery key file onto a USB media that you can use to mount the partition. And at boot up time, if you don't use either of those at boot up time, it probably just asks you for the password. But I don't know that because I haven't really worked with BitLocker to that extent. So now we're gonna go to the task scheduler. So we don't even need the command line, even though in the task scheduler we are going to use a command to schedule the auto mounting of the partition at boot up time, so that you don't have to manually go through the GUI and open up the encrypted. So it offers us to run as administrator, and I say why not, because we are gonna create this as a system level task. So it should pop up and ask me for the administrator password. Am I doing this as administrator, or am I in the kids account? I don't remember. But yep, I am the administrator. So task scheduler, local library, we click on local library and it should show us all of the tasks that are already in there, and I have a task in there already, so we can just modify it, or we can create a new one and then delete one of them, but we will need to change the value of the encryption key file. So we scroll all the way down and you see it says unlock D drive BitLocker. So we're going to create a new task. So click on create task here on the right side, and we will just name it. We can actually name it the same way I think Windows doesn't have, and we'll say unlock BitLocked D drive partition. We can provide a descriptor to it. It records who the author is. We're going to change user or group or who is going to execute this task, and we're going to type in system. Click on check names and it underscores it, saying yes, I know what you mean. I know who the user is. So there it is, NT authority /system, and then it grays out the options for run only when user is logged on, run whether user is logged on or not. And you can actually do that, so you can keep your user, if you have multiple users on the computer and you want only one user to be able to access that drive, then you would keep it as that user, and you would keep the option of run only when user is logged on. So run with highest privileges, I'm going to go ahead and check mark that because we want this to be on the system level. Hidden, I guess, gives you a bit of a security option, so that if somebody goes into the task scheduler looking for the details about how do you mount this drive, to discover where your BitLocker key file is, which you want to make this directory where the files live. You see I changed the icon on it, but you can go into properties and on the security tab select who is authorized to view. We click on advanced. To change permissions you click on edit. I guess you can also manipulate it here, but if we click on edit, it gives us a bit of an easier time. So authenticated users, they by default have all allow, so we would have to remove authenticated users and then all users, and we would have to add just our user to be able to read it. But in this case, I want all users to benefit from having that partition mounted, so I'm going to leave it at those defaults. But if you have a different idea in mind, then you can manipulate that and make that directory a bit more secure. So we are on the, I'm going to cancel out and show you that we are on the triggers tab, and we click on new, and default value is begin the task on a schedule, but we want it at startup. Begin the task at startup. You see a lot of options get removed. Delay task for 15 minutes. We don't have any need to delay it. Repeat task every each hour for duration of 1 day. We don't need that. Stop task if it runs longer than 3 days. It cannot be stopped. Once the drive is mounted, partition is mounted, it would take a different command to dismount it. Activate expire different dates. You can specify that it can only work on certain dates, which is not what we want right now. And enabled is important. We want this enabled. We can, if this is not checked, you can always go back to the task in the list, select it, and on the right you will have the option to enable it. Right now, see, there's an option to disable the task that we chose. So we check mark enabled, we click OK, and then actions, and this is where the command is going to be. And action is to start a program. There are a few choices: send an email, display a message. We want to start a program, and the command is manage BDE, and then we could also browse for it. It probably lives in system32 directory, and the options are dash unlock dash no dash D drive, and it can be lowercase or uppercase. I don't think it cares. Recovery key, and we need to provide it the full path to where the key lives. In my case, it's C drive / BitLocker directory, and this is where the value that we copied gonna come in handy, because it's not a value that we can BEK, and start in directory doesn't matter in this case, it's optional. So we click OK. So there's the command. It gets recorded. Conditions: start the task only if the computer is on AC power. So if it's a laptop, this option becomes important. Stop if the computer switches to battery power. So none of these are important to us because this is a standalone PC and it's always on AC power. So I'm going to even go ahead and uncheck those so it doesn't create any kind of confusion. But it would be safe to keep it on AC power, because the PC is always going to be on AC power. Start the task if the computer is idle for wake the computer to run this task. We don't need any of those. And then under settings, allow tasks to be run on demand. That's a fine one to keep if in case something happens and the drive doesn't get mounted, which I ran into a situation on a different computer that I'm configuring where Windows has stopped assigning a D drive letter to the bit-locked partition, and so the task can no longer work because one of the parameters that you pass to it is the D drive. If it doesn't have a D drive, you need to use a volume value, and I may play around with that, see what the command options are in terms of using it as a volume to mount it rather than rely on a drive letter. Stop the task if it runs longer than 3 days. We can uncheck mark that because the PC can be running for days, weeks, or months at a time, depending on how stable or how cluttered Windows gets. If the running task does not end when requested, force it to stop. That's fine. If something happens and for some reason Windows is repeatedly trying to run it, so if it'll stop it in the background, that'll be fine. If the task is not scheduled to run again, delete it after 30 days. We don't need that. If the task is already running, then the following rule applies: do not start a new instance. That's a fine option to have for us, because we expect the task to execute and be done with it. So I click OK, and this window I expect to disappear. Yep, and show me the unlock BitLocked D drive partition. So this is the task we created. The task has not yet run. The operation completed successfully. Author. It doesn't show us the details in this preview window, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the one that I had previously created, because well, first, before I delete it, I will show you the actions. You see it was using the same command, but the name of the key file, the BEK key file, was different because it was encrypted previously, and those values get hashed. And so we click on delete, and it says, do you want to delete this task? And we say yes, we want to delete it. So there's our startup task, and that's pretty much it. So next time we reboot the computer, the BitLocked partition will get started by default. And let's go to the command prompt and explore this manage BD command just a little bit, to demonstrate that this is the way to get more options. Oh, there's the webcam video. It was absent. So we're gonna go to cd BitLocker. Oh, I need to. So I have the Unix utilities installed, so I can do an ls command. But normally on Windows you would use dir. So see, if we use dir, we only see the recovery key. So we need to use dir a to show the BEK file, because it's marked as a hidden file. So manage BDE, and if we pass the option protectors and specify the D drive, dash get D drive, it will list us all of the protectors that exist for this drive. And in Linux speak, in LUKS, it needs administrative privileges, so we need to fire up the command line as an admin. You see I did a right click on the start menu, and that's how I get to the command line. You can also do it by searching for cmd.exe. So if I type cmd, it will find it, and it will give me the option to Stirlitz. It's okay, girl. So there's the command line, and in a minute it'll populate and give us the option to run it as administrator. So that's another way to start the command prompt as administrator. So it'll start a second one here in a minute. Yes, he prompts me for administrative privileges. Okay, but we don't need two command prompts, so we exit out of this one. So cd BitLocker dir/a. So there's our file, but we don't need it. So manage bde-protectors-get D drive. And we didn't need to be in the BitLocker directory for this command to work. So there's the hashed value of password. This must be the key under which the password value is stored in the registry. There's the numerical password, so that's the ID for the numerical password, which is in the name of the recovery key file, and the password itself is that long numerical string. And then it says there is an external key, so it has an ID 9C2, and that's actually how it starts, 92C1F5 499F5. Well, actually the ID of the file is in the name, external key file. I imagine that you can rename the file to make it more user-friendly, but then remember, you would have to go and edit that task. If we didn't save it to the USB, then Windows wouldn't create an external key. Normally, this value is absent, and you have to add a key, and that's what I was going to demonstrate in this video, but I didn't have to execute this. But the command would look like this. Manage students, it's okay. Manage BDE protectors dash add the value of the drive, and then recovery key, and then you would provide a directory where you want to save it. So it will automatically generate a key file and save it where you tell it to save it. But we didn't need to do this command, even though I wanted to demonstrate it. And also, if you are curious to see what's inside this file, well, it's an unreadable value. It's you can look at it with a hex editor and discover it, but it's a pretty secure file, unlike the text file that it saves, which has a clear text numerical value. If you wanted to save the key file with a separate command, if let's say you displaced your file but you still logged in, protectors-get D drive and -sek, which I imagine that stands for save encryption key, and once again you would give it a location where you want to save it, c:\BitLocker, which is our directory, but we don't need to do it because we'll just end up overwriting the file that we have. But this is a way to retrieve the encryption key file. And if we do manage BDE and /?, which is the way to get help on any command in Windows, you can see that we get a lot of options, and here in examples it gives us the status. Oh, it needs to be dash status. And so it says disk volumes that can be protected with BitLocker drive. So it tells us that we can BitLocker the flash drive, and then the volume D drive is BitLocked. It says BitLocker version 2, use space, encryption method XTEAS128, which I believe CryptLocker uses, and Windows has just recently added it. Remember, it was asking us, do you want to do the new type of encryption, or do you want to do the old type encryption? And this is where Linux is more flexible, because you do encryption with the crypt setup command on the command line, and сейчас пойдем штириться, сейчас пойдем. And you can provide it what type of encryption do you want, and same thing with Truecrypt. In fact, I have VeraCrypt installed, and I can demonstrate, because VeraCrypt is very much basically an enhanced version of Truecrypt. They just added some additional. Nope, that's not what I meant to do. Windows 10 is a little bit more confusing in navigation than, let's say, Windows 7 is. And of course, Windows 8, they really screwed up with Windows 8 at first by only providing the Metro interface at first, which took aback a lot of system administrators, because they were like, we are administrating servers, and why do we have this Metro interface, the confusing Metro interface that's more intended for end users and more intended for tablets and touchscreen PCs. So here's VeraCrypt, and if we were to say let's see, tools, benchmark, travel, volume expander, I think it's under volumes, yeah. Create a new volume, and let's see what options would it give us. Create an encrypted file container. I actually do use that function. I store my sensitive personal data in an encrypted file container that is automatically synced to Dropbox. So nobody at Dropbox, or nobody who breaks into my Dropbox, would be able to read that data, because it's an encrypted container. But I benefit from being able to sync up that file. So encrypt a non-system partition drive, or encrypt the system partition. So right now, you can see that system partition is VeraCrypted or Truecrypted, and that's what I've been doing for years, and that's what I got used to. That's why I never really looked into BitLocker. And like I said, the reason I do it is because Truecrypt and VeraCrypt can be decrypted with crypt setup command on Linux. So it's very convenient to use live Linux CDs, or dual boot into Linux on this machine, decrypt the Windows OS partition, and perform a full image backup of it. So it's already encrypted. What happens if we look at volume properties? So you see mode of operation is XTS, just like in Windows. This I don't know what the value is. Data read since mount, data written since mount. You see it read a lot of gigabytes, and that's probably because I was doing, I've got system backups performed, and I performed full image backups from Linux, and it records it as statistics. VeraCrypt bootloader, encrypted portion, fully encrypted, where Windows tells us that only used space is encrypted. Block size 128 bits, which is what this part right here I imagine is a AES. Encryption algorithm is AES, so you see XTS AES 128. So it's basically analogous to what VeraCrypt or Truecrypt does. And so why did they ever proclaim that why did they ever proclaim that Truecrypt had security flaws? There was something about retrieving keys from RAM while the system runs. So encrypt a non-system partition drive. We don't have a partition to encrypt, but we'll pretend that we do. I just want to show you the options, and of course it wants an administrator privilege to do that, which makes sense. So now it should present us with a dialog. So standard VeraCrypt, this is once again where VeraCrypt has advantage over BitLocker. You can create a hidden VeraCrypt volume, and that basically creates a partition within a partition, and because the outside partition is also encrypted, so the internal VeraCrypt volume becomes just a number of gibberish numbers. So if somebody is doing a secure analysis of the partition, they cannot tell where a hidden volume begins or ends, or if it's even there. So this is a very strong security feature for those who are paranoid. Select device. Well, we can select the flash drive and actually even go through the motions of encrypting it, because I don't have anything else on that drive right now. Create encrypted volume and formatted. This would lose all the data that's on the drive is right now, which is fine, but it gives us the encrypt partition in place, which is the only option you get with BitLocker. It does not destroy drives, where if you go with VeraCrypt and you create encrypted volume and format it, it will give you the option of wiping it, basically writing zeros or whatever. So that's the so the space that was unused, would be wiped. So it is more secure in this case. So here we go, encryption algorithm. You do not get any of these choices with BitLocker. If you are familiar with what these encryption algorithms do and what's the strong sides and weak sides of each one, you can choose. AES is the standard one, and federally approved cipher is ridged and dial, that may be used by U.S. government departments and agencies. So 256-bit key, 128-bit block, 14 rounds. So it's AES-256. So it's actually stronger. So BitLocker makes me think that BitLocker is actually not even compliant with federal requirements. There's more information on EAS. Hash algorithm, also you get a choice. Looks like the strongest one is selected, SHA 512. I don't know about Whirlpool or Streetbog. SHA 256 is fewer bits, looks like. So then if we click next, doesn't give us a choice because we're encrypting a full partition, full device. But if we were doing a file-based container, then we would be able to select the size for the container. So here's the password portion, and it is safe for me to type it. And we can use key files with a non-system partition. So add files, it doesn't give you, or create random key file. Let's go ahead and do that. So as we move the mouse and it gives us time, you see the scroll bar goes. So if we move the mouse randomly, which of course, what is randomness? We still might be and it works only while you're within the window. So but it basically creates what's called entropy, and entropy in the encryption is very important. It's basically randomness, and the computers have random numbers generators built into them, operating systems, not the PCs themselves. Although if there is a TPM chip, trusted platform module, I think it's called, I imagine that the TPM chips may be also providing a random number generator, which, as you know, in the computing world, there is no such thing as randomness. Computers are logical, straightforward devices, and so the random values that they provide are not entirely random. They are a sequence, and if you read anything about hackers, about successful break-ins, there were hackers that hacked into the slot machines. Well, actually, I think that's an Ocean 11 or Ocean 13 movie, where they figured out how to detect at which point in the random key generation sequence the machine is. So then they had the whole library of what random numbers it was providing. So once they knew where in the sequence it is, they were able to predict what values the slot machine was gonna perform on the display, and they could bet appropriately and win a lot of money, and I guess to get to jackpot. Display pool content. So if we checkmark that, we get hexadecimal values, where if we don't display, it just gives us these pluses and minuses, this gibberish. But if we click on display pool value, so you can see once again VeraCrypt is much more advanced than BitLocker. BitLocker is user friendly, does things for you. In the GUI doesn't even offer you a lot of options. So number of key files is 1. Key file size in bytes. The more bytes it is, the stronger the value of it is. But the thing about key files is that you gotta so base name. So we'll give it VeraCrypt, and I guess it will append a value. So now generate and save key file, and I'll go ahead and save it into the BitLocker directory, even though this is a VeraCrypt file. Key files have been successfully created. Let's go to the command line and see what is it that got saved. Oh, it just says VeraCrypt. So if we, and let's see how it compares in size. Yeah, I'm gonna use the -L command because I'm a Windows noob. So you can see that the VeraCrypt file is 64 bytes in size, while the Windows one is 124 bytes in size. So the Windows file is longer, is larger. And if we do the more command, once again, we get gibberish. It's hexadecimal values. So we save the key file, so we can close this window, and we can add a file to encrypting of our flash drive. So select key file, we go to the C drive BitLocker directory and select our VeraCrypt key file. So I guess I should have chosen a bit more of a user-friendly name. So this will insert a key file into the header of the encrypted container, and in Linux speak, those are called slots, and there is only a certain number of slots because the header is, specific size. Use PIM. This is something that VeraCrypt introduced that Truecrypt doesn't have, and I don't know what it stands for. Personal identification something or other. So we click next, and it says your password is short. That's fine. Do you want to do large files? Yes. I don't know why Truecrypt or VeraCrypt even asks about that. I guess it chooses which file system you want to create on it. So, but then it gives you the option of selecting it yourself. And if you're running VeraCrypt on Linux, you will get choices for Linux type file system formats like ext2, ext3, ext4, and I'm not even sure that it will give you choices for NTFS. And you can choose the cluster size. We'll opt for quick format, and it warns you. It says you should use, well actually let's not use quick format and see how it will offer us the So see, we once again collect randomness, random pool, and you can either see the hexadecimal values scrolling, or it just, you know, gives header key, master key. Those are obscured from us, but gives us an idea that there is a header key and a master key, which we don't know. So actually, I'm usually not so patient and I don't do all the mouse movements, but in this case we've got mouse movements. So now, well, it didn't offer me to do the wiping, but I guess the option of quick format is what really you know, takes care of it. So we selected to overwrite the existing file system on it, to basically blow away whatever we had on the flash drive. So it tells us that it's gonna take 15 minutes. It's not the fastest SD card there is, but because those are USB card readers, and most likely on this computer it's USB 2, so we are limited to something like 50 megabytes per second in speed. I think it's 48 for the USB 2 standard, so 48 megabytes per system. But then the speed of the SD card comes into play, and also the CPU has to do some work. Let's open Task Manager and see what is CPU usage is like. And it's taking a while to open, so I imagine that the CPU is busy crunching numbers and creating encryption. Now, on read time, I remember how Truecrypt was claiming that there is no slowdown to the system. There is no noticeable slowdown to the system for using. Yeah, look, the CPU is pegged. And if we look at the processes, I imagine VeraCrypt. Now, actually, Bandicam is using about 40%, and VeraCrypt format is using about 10% of the CPU. So, well, the screencast Bandicam application is doing a video encoding, and that's a lot of number crunching too. So it's not surprising that the CPU is used up. Like I said, this computer is about 10 years old. You see, it's got a dual core AMD processor that's running at about 3 gigahertz, but it's no match to modern i5 or Intel i5 or i7 or even AMD's Ryzen, I think they're called, CPUs. So I'm going to pause and let this flash drive gets encrypted, and then we will explore a little bit more. Okay, the flash drive encryption process has completed, and it took a little time because VeraCrypt has gone through every single sector or block and wrote into it an encrypted value. Where, as you saw in BitLocker, we have the option of either doing that and encrypting the whole surface of the partition, or just the used space. And right now we're doing just the used space. So the empty space, if there used to be something sensible there but was deleted, it still lives there. The information still lives there, and somebody who is versed in cryptanalysis could actually take that partition and read the raw values of it and recover files in the unencrypted portions, which of course would still be difficult to do, because when you look at the hexadecimal values, well, I imagine that the encrypted hexadecimal would look more like randomness, where if it is an unencrypted file on the partition and you look at the hexadecimal values, you might be able to discern where the headers, the beginning of files are, and where the end is, and you could even probably recover part of the name of the file. But basically, there are more patterns in unencrypted values for files, and that's what cryptanalysis delivers, is that it judges how much randomness there is, and that's why there is a proliferation of encryption algorithms, because some of the algorithms they have a weakness where a cryptanalysis can provide somebody with information about some kind of pattern, and then they will be able from that pattern to understand what the encryption key is and to be able to decrypt. So, and there are competitions actually on encryption algorithms, and AES encryption algorithm, which is now used in Wi-Fi WPA as opposed to WEP encryption. So your Wi-Fi is encrypted. Your data that's transferred over Wi-Fi is encrypted with AES. And there is a choice of TKIP key, and I forget what the other choice, but usually it's a combination of the two. But somebody who is intercepting your radio signals, your Wi-Fi signals, they cannot discern what data is being transmitted because it's encrypted. So let's see, we've got a warning box saying that original drive letter F should be used only in case you need to remove encryption from the partition, etc. Well, as you will see in VeraCrypt, we can pick whatever letter we want. The VeraCrypt volume has been successfully created. So now we can either click next if we want to create more volumes, which we don't, or click exit. And if we go to the file browser, now Windows is going to complain and say, this drive is unreadable, do you want to format it? It's oblivious to the fact that it's, oh no, I don't want it device managers, I want it disk management. Let's go through this again. Disk management, yes. And you saw that when we were encrypting, the choice was SDA1 partition. It is also possible to encrypt the device that doesn't have partitions. You can encrypt the whole device with Truecrypt or VeraCrypt, and I don't know about crypt setup. I haven't used it in that fashion. Actually, crypt setup, I believe, well, I've used it on partitions only basis. I haven't used it on full drive basis, so I can't speak about it. But Truecrypt and VeraCrypt, I have encrypted drives without partitions, but that makes it harder to work with them. I forget what the issues were for me, but I have reverted back to using partition-based encryption. And when that happens, the partition header gets destroyed, and instead an encryption header is written, which means that the file system that you format in the encrypted drive, the header for that partition for that file system is located somewhere further down, so you lose a little bit of space when you do encryption, but it's negligible, and you are doing encryption for a reason, so the benefits outweigh the loss of space. If you are scrambling for less than a kilobyte or a couple of kilobytes of space, then you are in trouble. And of course nowadays Well, unless you use SSD drives, the SSD drives still come in 64, 128, or 256 gigabytes sizes. It's a little less uncommon to have SSDs to be in the terabyte territory, and those SSDs command a large price. And if you purchase a really budget notebook, then it's actually, I've seen them come with 32 gigabytes SSDs, and 32 gigabytes is barely enough to install Windows 10, and Windows 7 even would be pretty crammed on 32 gigabytes and leaves you basically very little room to store your own files. So I don't know why manufacturers do that. You know, the price difference between 32 gigabytes and 64 gigabytes is not all that much, so it wouldn't add all that much to the price of a notebook, but they do that. The same thing with Android cell phones. I don't know what happens nowadays. I haven't been in the market for a new cell phone in a while, but you know, the most common size of the flash partition for the drive was 8 gigabytes, which is really not enough, because the Android ROMs that the providers would install on those phones would easily take up a lion's share of that 8 gigabytes of flash. But I digress. Disk Manager opened up, and now if we look to see at the F drive, you see Windows is oblivious. It says it's raw. And if we right click, it gives us the choice of formatting it and creating a partition, creating a file system on it. But if we go to VeraCrypt, and the F letter is used up right now, which I can free it up. So I right click on the F drive, and Windows is thinking for a minute. Come on, Windows. So change drive letter and paths, and we can free up the F drive, the F letter, so we remove it. Some programs rely on drive letters. Yes, we know that. I've discovered that with BitLocker, to the extent that I now need to explore all of the BDE commands. You see, it's actually not a very big list. Status, on, off, pause, resume, lock, unlock. You see, there's the unlock command with manage-bde, which is basically, in my mind, in Linux speak, would be lock would be dismount a BitLocker volume, where in the GUI, as we demonstrated, it was confusing. Okay, Windows is thinking for a while to remove this drive letter. I would probably benefit from just ejecting the drive and reinserting it, and then Windows would probably not assign a letter to it. Okay, it finished what it was doing, but it's not responding. I want to do a refresh actions. Or it was unable to remove the drive letter. Okay, it's frozen. The CPU is working overtime, and as you saw, it's mostly the video encoding that's okay. Here's refresh. Let's see if the F drive letter has actually gone away. But now I'm even more interested in BitLocker, so I will try to install a Windows operating system into a virtual machine. I will probably go with Windows 7 because that has BitLocker in it as well, and go through the process of encrypting the OS system drive and see what options do I get, and I will make a different video recording about it. And of course this video is becoming to be quite lengthy, where we're up to 2 hours, but I do like to explain what is going on, and I hope I've gone quite in depth with you guys to explain what's the difference between BitLocker encryption and Truecrypt encryption and Linux encryption, and how do they work in the situation when you are trying to encrypt complete drives. Okay, I'm gonna try to go to the Explorer and do an eject on this card, and maybe that will be a faster method. Okay, is it even gonna give me an eject? It still says 8 data 8 gig, which I guess because we didn't encrypt complete drive, we just encrypted a partition, the MBR on the flash drive is still intact, and that's what has the name. But it doesn't give me an eject option. It doesn't give me any option with this drive. Yeah, pin to start expand. Let's see if we have anything in the... We don't have an option there. So we're kind of... Okay, the F drive is gone. Okay, so it took a little time for Windows to think about it. So now the F drive is available here, and we can select device. There's the removable medium, the 8 gig SD card. So we put it, we select it, and then we select which drive letter we want, F, G, or H. We'll use F because that's been gone away. So now VeraCrypt is going to ask me for the encryption password. And let's see how it works with key files, if it's going to require for me to use a key file, or if the password is sufficient and you can use either or. You can use key files or you can use passwords. And when I click on it may actually come up with a box, with a message box here that gives me the option of using the key file, and we can try both methods. And my gosh, this CPU is struggling to do both video encryption, encoding, it's rather called, and to run other programs. This computer has 8 gigs of memory, and let's see, oh, we're only using 3 gigs of memory out of 6. Oh, it has 7 gigs of memory, I'm sorry, but we're using only 3 gigs out of the 6 that it sees. Okay, back to VeraCrypt. Okay, VeraCrypt has finally responded, so it's asking us for the decryption password, and here's the use key files option, and we can dismount and then try to mount with a key file. But right now I'm just going to try to use the password and see if that alone works. And it is spinning a please wait box again. I'm gonna pause. So the VeraCrypt came back to me and said, watch out, the caps lock was on. So it's possible that you typed in the wrong password, or the password didn't match. So I'm going to repeat the process. Okay, VeraCrypt returned, and it said incorrect password, PIM number, hash. It's not mentioning key files, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to use both the password and the key file, add files, and see if once you have a key file, if you are actually required to use it, which does seem to be the case at this point. So where's my C drive? C drive, BitLocker. there's my VeraCrypt key file. Okay, there it is. Okay, use key files and a password. I believe I'm typing in the right password. So VeraCrypt is once again telling us to wait. Okay, it does look like when you have a key file inserted into the header of the VeraCrypt encrypted container, partition, drive, whatever it is, you have to use both key file and the password. And then it mounts it. And we mounted it at F drive just like we had before. So if I click on it, now Windows is happy. It says, yeah, this is a fine drive. And if we create a new file on it or a directory, it will write to it. Remember, we formatted it as NTFS. We could have done FAT32 because it's just an 8 GB card. We're not going to do files greater than 2 gigs on it. I believe that's the FAT32 limitation. Okay, Windows is thinking again. Okay, Windows has finally come back, so let's say text file. And we'll just call it test. There, it saved it to the SD card. And we can edit it. So there we inserted some text into it. Close it. And if we go to the command line and we go to the F drive, we can see the file is there. And if we look at the contents of the file, there's the blah 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 content. So it works just fine. So now here's the danger. If Windows gives us the eject, no, it doesn't. It only has format. So we got to be careful because now, and let's go to look at disk management, and it will probably report that this is an F drive. So VeraCrypt, works, we may say, seamlessly with Windows, and Windows is kind of oblivious. As we saw that before we decrypted the drive, it was appearing as raw. It still appears as raw. It doesn't show it in, I'm going to refresh one more time. In the disk manager, I guess it's reading more than what the file explorer. I guess VeraCrypt works on a different OS level, and disk management is working on a lower level where it's reading the card. So it's not showing us the F drive, although if gives us an opportunity to change driver letter, and I imagine that the F letter should not be available in the list. You see, it's not in the list. Disk management utility realizes that that drive letter is absent, but it's pointless for us to assign a drive letter to that drive. So here we have it, and now we want to dismount. And see, this is where the lingo that made me confused in Windows. I'm used to the language of dismount or mount, and this is very much Linux lingo. And you see, as we dismounted it, the Windows Explorer window even got closed. Oh, it gave us a message that we are located in the F drive. So I'm going to say no, do not force the dismount, and try to do it nicely again. Because if there are any files open, or even the partition itself is mounted, it might end up being in inconsistent state. even though NTFS is a journaled system. See, this is where FAT32 has a disadvantage, because it's not a journaled system, and if it gets corrupted, that's where you have to run the disk check utility to locate orphaned sectors or blocks or whatever you want to call it. So now we dismounted it. The F letter is available again. If we go to disk management and we do a refresh, now I selected, oh yeah, we're fine. Refresh. It will stay with an unassigned drive letter, but I don't have an eject function, but nothing is writing to it, so I guess I can just pop it out and then pop it back in and see how Windows is going to react to it. So yeah, there is no drive letter assigned to it. It doesn't show up in the File Explorer. Yeah, File Explorer, if we look at the list, we've got the C drive, we've got the D drive, and the swap partition. So I'm going to pop out the SD card. Is Windows going to give me a chime? So I'm going to give it a few seconds. No, Windows didn't give me a chime. Now I pop it back in, and let's see how Windows is going to react to it. Do I get a chime? Okay, it shows it as a removable drive. It doesn't say raw anymore, but if we do a refresh, will it read it? But it did not assign it a drive letter. And the next step I'll do is I will assign it a drive letter, pop it out and pop it back in, and what you will see is that Windows remembers devices, and I imagine that Windows will assign it a drive letter if I pop it out and pop it back in again, because it will remember what this is. And this time we'll assign something different than F, just so that we can confirm that Windows is assigning the drive letter that we chose, rather than just any available one in the list. Okay, so it's thinking for a little bit. So the disk management actually got upset with me and said the operation failed to complete because the disk management console view is not up to date. Refresh the view by using the refresh task. If the problem persists, close the disk management console, then restart disk management or restart the computer. And we already did the refresh action, and it did not tell us that it's a raw disk. I also have computer management open, so I'll close that just to keep things less confused. So yeah, it still doesn't say raw, so it'll still complain to me. So their recommendation is close. Just like everything in Windows, if you are in doubt, restart. Linux in this regard is much nicer. So will it tell me that it's raw? I'm going to pause again because it's going to take it a while to connect to the virtual disk service. Okay, the disk manager returned, and this time it does say raw, and in the list you see disk 1 partition 1, and so disk 1 partition 1. So now let's try to assign a drive letter to it. Okay, and we have an A drive letter, which used to be for floppy drives, but this is an A data brand SD card, so we'll assign it the A drive letter instead of F, and then we'll pop it out and pop it back in and observe how Windows is going to behave. because the partition is encrypted, so Windows cannot read it without us explicitly mounting it with VeraCrypt. And so File Explorer is complaining. It detected that the disk was inserted and says, you want to format it? And no, I don't want to format it. So now if we look in the list, we've got removable disk A. It's not even reading the name of it anymore. I guess it was showing it because it remembered. The disk manager is not responding, but at this point I kinda don't care about the disk manager as much. Okay, it refreshed, but it's not showing me a drive letter. I'm gonna try to refresh one more time and see if it will show us that the drive letter was assigned. Okay, it refreshed and it does show us the A drive letter. So now I'm gonna look for the eject function. So I did a right click. Yes, we've got eject. Interesting. So now we eject it. Okay. Windows is going to pop up with a message saying safe to remove drive. Are we going to get a message? Or is it going to come back later? Well, we're not getting a message, but it did disappear from Windows Explorer, which basically means that yes, you can. Oh, there we go. Safe to remove hardware. Can now be safely removed. So we remove it. Give it a few seconds. We didn't hear a chime upon removing it, but I'm going to insert it and expect that Windows will assign. Actually, let's go to the disk management and do a. Well, actually, it already shows disk 1 removable, no media. If we scroll down, we've got a CD-ROM and one SD card reader. So I'm going to insert it, and Windows is probably going to complain again and say, do you want to format it? And that's the danger with encrypted SD cards, is that if you're not keeping it secure, or if yourself forget that it's a format, it's an encrypted SD card, you might accidentally format it and lose important data. Okay, so I inserted it, but Windows is taking a little while to think. The disk management actually sees it, but we don't have a drive letter yet. And of course, we may not get a drive letter. Okay, refresh. So I refreshed disk management and it's not showing me a drive letter, and Windows did not complain about the SD card. It completely ignored the fact that I inserted. Oh, now it says this file does not have an app associated with it. Please install an app. Okay, is it gonna show us the A drive? And I close the disk management so that I can open it up again, because that seems to be Microsoft's advice with dealing disk manager not doing a refresh properly. So disk management, it's going to take a little while to connect to the virtual disk service. Yes, it looks like we've got an A drive letter. You see it's a simple basic raw, and it doesn't list it as disk 1 partition 1, it lists it as the A drive letter. So there's the A drive letter. Why did the File Explorer not refresh? Actually, in Windows 10, I so far did not find where the refresh option is. And if I right click here, I don't get a refresh. I get pin to start. If I right click here, I may get a refresh. Yeah, I have a refresh here, but it only refreshes this pane. So we didn't get the A drive show up in the File Explorer. If I close it and open it again, which seems to be the Microsoft's way of doing things, then I may see it. Yes, now I see it. Yeah, this is Windows. This is, you know, when in doubt, reboot, restart, or reinstall Windows if you're having problems. Linux in this regard is much better. So there we have it. Disk drive A is unrecognizable. We need to mount it with VeraCrypt, and I think at this point I've shared enough with you. I was gonna just show how to auto mount BitLocker partitions when the system partition is not encrypted with BitLocker. Do I still have an eject? But I ended up going a bit more in depth and talking to you about the theory of encrypting hard drives in dual boot situation, which is what I've got. But now I'm curious about BitLocker more, and my plan is to install Windows, and I'll probably install Windows 7 into a virtual machine without dual boot, just Windows, just like the way you would get with a PC purchased, you know, brand new from a vendor. You would just have pure Windows on it. Dell used to sell computers that were that had Linux installed on them, but that's not something that they can continue to do. I don't think. I haven't seen that. So at this point I'm going to say goodbye. This is pretty lengthy, but I hope you've learned something, and I definitely enjoy sharing the information and the knowledge that I have, and that's why I've recorded this video. So I say goodbye, and until the next time, bye.